On 31st October 2000, the United Nations Security Council unanimously passed Resolution 1325, formally recognizing the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, the impact of conflict on women, and the significant role women play in conflict prevention, resolution, and post-conflict reconstruction. Since then, 9 further resolutions have been adopted, addressing women's active and effective participation and the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence. The Women, Peace and Security Agenda, popularly abbreviated as WPS, is underlined by 4 pillars: participation, protection, prevention, relief, and recovery. Today, 32 African countries have adopted national action plans to implement WPS. Welcome to Season 5 of the She Stands for Peace podcast, a series by the United Nations Office to the African Union, supported by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Over the past 4 seasons, we have interviewed key actors working to achieve the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in Africa. And in Season 4, we took a documentary approach to bringing you a range of perspectives and insights. In this 5th season, we return to our interview format. And in this episode, I am joined by Ambassador Nicola Brennan, Ireland's ambassador to Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Djibouti, and permanent representative to the African Union and Ireland's representative to IGAD and UNECA. Ambassador Brennan, speaking from Addis Ababa, shares with me her reflections on Ireland's Africa strategy and support for the African Union's flagship agenda to silence the guns in Africa. Thank you so much for doing this interview, Ambassador Nicola Brennan. Your experience in Africa is quite extensive. You were the Director of International Development Policy in the Development Cooperation and Africa Division of the Foreign Affairs Department in Ireland, where you led the development of the government's international development policy called A Better World. You served as the Deputy Head of Mission and Head of Departments for the Irish Foreign Affairs Department in South Africa, in Uganda, and Zambia. And of course, you have been Ireland's ambassador to Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Djibouti, and the permanent representative to the African Union and representative to IGAD and UNECA. But I want to start our conversation today with the Good Friday Agreement. So what can you tell us about the experiences of women of the Republic of Ireland in the peace processes that led to the Good Friday Agreement?
Okay, so the Women's Coalition, they really needed this variety of life skills that they brought to the coalition, really to manage the backlash that they experienced during the negotiation process. So even though they managed to get themselves organised, politically active, elected members, and to be at that negotiation table, they weren't welcome with open arms. And they endured many discriminatory comments from their male counterparts. They endured threats from outside parties, and they really had to push hard for their voices to be heard. So I really applaud them, because I think we stand on their shoulders as women of today in terms of the work that we do on trying to ensure that in the peace processes in the world that we are supporting and engaged in, that women's voices are heard, but not only that, that women are really supported. They are really supported to participate. They are empowered to do so and supported to do so. Because as I said, the environment can often be quite challenging for women to push their way in and get involved.
And of course, as we would expect, the agreement emphasizes human rights, equality, and eliminating discrimination. So how would you reflect on the Good Friday Agreement in the context of the wider Women, Peace and Security agenda, especially when it comes to women's participation in elections, political leadership, and the 4 pillars of WPS?
From our experience of the Northern Ireland peace process, that women's participation makes a huge difference to the positive outcome of peace building. But I think also we've learned, and I think it really reflects what I was saying earlier, that in order to sustain this positive influence, women really need to be supported in their peace building activities and engagement. And what the Women's Coalition allowed was the meaningful engagement of women, and that's core to the Women, Peace and Security agenda, as we know. And it had twin goals of women's participation, but also of achieving an agreement for a durable settlement that would win the consent of the people of Northern Ireland. And as you highlighted there, for the Women's Coalition, their starting point was a set of values and principles based on human rights. And the end point was a commitment to finding an accommodation for the common good, taking into account differing interests. And I want to really put forward this point about what this coalition did on rights, equality, and non-discrimination. And what they had to do, and what they did very effectively, was challenge the whole process and language around adversarial politics. And I think this is really, really important. So, they did garner support of mediators and of the people, when in particular they highlighted that violent, militaristic language, such as using the language of conflict and battle and destroying, etc. And they used different language. And they really interrupted this kind of adversarial approach and set new standards by using different language, by showing that they could dialogue, that they could bring a different idea to the table, that they could be, much more conciliatory. They could be creative and innovative and reframe issues in a different way. That resonated with the people, and therefore they got a lot of support. I mean, they had huge influence on the agreement in the end. They made invaluable contributions. I think they advocated for provisions on human rights, equality and reconciliation. And they also inserted proposals on women's participation. And I think particularly, too, ensured that victims of the conflict were included in the peace process. Because often, again, as we know, the voices of victims, be they women or men, are not actually heard. So I think their engagement in the peace talks had a lasting impact. And they really created a channel for excluded voices to be heard. And I think that's a really important point as well, that voices shouldn't be excluded. It should be inclusive. And again, I wanted to say this, they've been characterized, and I love this phrase, they were characterized as the conscience of the negotiations. And that's really, really powerful. And I think, they really demonstrated that they could work across political divide, across difference, across diversity, and they could bring a voice that, brought things together. And they were very effective. I mean, as I said earlier, they brought skills from their own professional careers and their own life skills, and they were able to communicate effectively across different political disciplines. They were able to facilitate dialogue. They were able to test new ideas, and they were able to frame solutions and bring things forward. And that really, really helped. I mean, it was very hard, as I said earlier, and I don't think we should forget that. While this is, I think, a really good example of what can happen and it can help to transform processes, it was incredibly hard for them to do that. I mentioned earlier about the need to support women's role in peace building. And I think that's a really, really important part as well. And that and Northern Ireland showed this as well, that many women had to sacrifice their own need for education, employment, personal development in order to simply survive and manage their family life. In many cases, their husbands, fathers, brothers, had been killed or imprisoned, and they were, left to keep the family together. And in Northern Ireland, we saw, and I know in many situations we see this, it leads to generational cycles of underachievement, and particularly among women in marginalised groups. So, this we see as a real legacy of our situation. And since, post the peace agreement in the early 1980s, the Government of Ireland recognised this and really put in place different mechanisms to support women in peace building and in civic and political life, to empower women to become leaders in their own communities. And also, more recently, they provided support to develop an all-island women's forum. So that's with Northern Ireland and the Republic. And it really focuses on addressing underrepresentation of women and developing women's role in civic society peacebuilding, while also looking to build better understanding across different community divides.
So, I mean, many of what you're saying there in the years that I've been doing this podcast really resonates with, different contexts of conflict also in Africa in terms of the kind of role women play, but also the level of resilience and resistance to being left out, right, that we see in across the continent. So it's interesting to see the examples there that you've given in Ireland really also is important in Africa as well. So turning our focus to Africa now, in June 2019, Ireland launched its third national action plan on the WPS agenda. And there was a renewed focus on gender-based violence, both in Ireland but also overseas as well. And also in November of that year, you also launched the Africa Strategy 2025. And through that, the government committed to spending at least 250 million euros over a period of 5 years on various priorities, including efforts to improve access to education for girls. In the Africa Strategy, one of the priority areas for your Africa partnerships was to achieve and champion a leadership role for women in conflict prevention and peace-building processes, empowering young people, and to facilitate dialogue on the implementation of national action plans. So 2025 is just around the corner. As we approach it, what would you say were the key lessons learned regarding Ireland's work in Africa, your commitments to the Africa Strategy, and Ireland's support for the African Union's flagship project called the Silencing the Guns in Africa?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think I would start by very humbly saying we have learned a huge amount. And I think it's hugely important to continue to challenge ourselves, to learn from what we're doing, to try new things. And I think in this agenda, the whole area of women's participation, women, peace and security, it's an incredibly long-term agenda. And I think that, one of the biggest things the global community in this space has learned, that building lasting peace is not possible without building a more equal and inclusive society. So it's not just a sectoral engagement. This is, a fundamental to achieving gender equality and equal rights for women and girls. And that to me is, as I said at the very outset, core to our foreign policy and the work that we do here in Ethiopia with the African Union and across the continent of Africa. I think one of the other key lessons learned, and some of these will be very well known to your audience, but that we've learned to address, that we really need to understand and address the root causes of violence, conflict, inequality, and really work to address these in order to prevent cyclical conflicts persisting, because that's what we're seeing in many places. Every so many years, another conflict arises, as we've seen here where I am present in Ethiopia. I think also we've learned that our men are fundamental to the response and also need to be part of the solution. So while women's space, agency, voice and participation is ultimate priority, in order to achieve that, we have to address a lot of the issues with our men as well, because they're often, and as we know, the leaders in peace processes, they're often the reason conflicts emerge, and women bear the burden and are not included. So it is really, really fundamental to the solution. And I think, again, for us, we've learned that there's a need to continue to advocate. And I think our voice is really, really important as international actors on the continent of Africa and partners with the Africa member states and the African Union, etc. We really need to continue to advocate for women's participation and women's voice so that women's inclusion becomes standard practice rather than an afterthought. And then finally, I would say in terms of our lessons learned for us as an embassy here and as a Department of Foreign Affairs, we continue to challenge ourselves. We continue to learn. We continue to try and build our capacity as an organisation around advancing gender equality in all aspects of our work. And I've done that very intentionally here at the embassy, where I've worked with my team regardless of what their role is, be it on admin, be it a support team, be it in different sectoral areas. We have worked really to build up capacity and understanding of gender issues, as well as women's place in the world and how we challenge ourselves personally as well as in our professional selves is equally important. So I suppose there's some of the lessons that we have learned, Yemisi, and then just moving on in terms of your other questions around, how have we delivered on our commitments in the Africa strategy? I think, first of all, I would say, one of the key commitments in there is that Ireland would be, and I think we are achieving that, a credible voice for gender equality in multilateral fora. You probably are aware we were a member of the UN Security Council in 2021 and 2022. And during that time, we co-chaired the UNSC's informal expert group on women, peace and security alongside Mexico. And with Mexico and Kenya, we kickstarted a WPS presidency trio. And that was really to work during our respective council presidencies on raising the issues of WPS and of the impact of violence on women in the context of conflict. And this particular initiative has led to further, I think it's around 9 council members taking this initiative forward. So they've continued to advocate for women's voice at the UN Security Council, ensuring that what analysis is being presented or what issue is being discussed, we look at it also from a women's perspective. So that's been really, really important to us. We also, across the multilateral system, use our voice and our influence to push for stronger language on gender equality, on women, peace and security, and on conflict-related sexual violence and survivors' rights. And that's very much core to, again, our foreign policy, also our international development policy. And we really continue to advocate in the multilateral system. We are a proud member of the European Union. We also use our position there to push the EU to have a stronger focus on gender equality, and not only in their programming, but also in their diplomatic engagement and also in their financing. And similarly for the IFIs. So, Ireland is a member right across these, multilateral and international fora, and we feel it's incredibly important to use our voice consistently to advocate for women, peace and security, addressing gender inequality, etc. We have about, I think, 14 embassies in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, and a number of those are supporting the development and implementation of national action plans. We use that learning to engage and support the African Union Office of the Special Envoy in Women, Peace and Security, Madam Diop. She's doing great work with her team. And also the UN Women and the UN Organization to the African Union. So we've had a very strong partnership there. And, a lot of it is about getting these plans developed. But often the challenge is once they're developed, nothing happens and they're never implemented. So we've worked with the Special Envoy's Office in particular to put in a monitoring and compliance framework where countries are making commitments on women, peace and security, then they need to report back to the African Union on that. So there is an iterative process and a peer review process to move that forward. And I think that's working very well. I'm also accredited to the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. And they work on the Horn of Africa, and they've been very much involved in peace processes, both here in Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan. And we've worked very closely with them and have challenged them, particularly on their institutional capacity and response on women, peace and security, and ensuring that women are present in peace processes. And I think one of the other things we've learned as well is that women need to be involved right from the design stage. It's not like we get to the peace process. We all know that a peace process doesn't happen over a week in South Africa or a week in Djibouti. It happens over a very long period of time. So it's not just parachuting the women into the table when peace agreement is going to be signed. We women need to be very much involved from the get-go. And I think that's, these are the kind of things that we advocate for. We've a range of support as well, Yemisi, across different programs that address women's participation, women's rights organisations, etc., And we're working through many of our partners, the UN, international NGOs and in governments to try and, push forward this agenda.
I mean, it's good that you mentioned your work with women rights organizations, because that's going to be my next question, because you as Ambassador of Ireland to Ethiopia in October 2022, I believe it was, made that commitment to support women's rights organizations and the international advocacy to support Africa's women's peace and security agenda. And this is really important because in many episodes of this podcast, what keeps coming back from these women at the grassroots is that, yes, they need financial support, but they need it not just for the projects that they do, but for the people that are doing the projects, right? They talk about the impact of the work that they do on their mental health, on their safety, the safety of their families. But most times, donors and grant makers focus on the project, not the people behind the project. So how has Ireland approached its support to women's rights and grassroots WPS organizations since you've been ambassador to Ethiopia? And very importantly, what are those key lessons you'd like to share with the international community that Ireland as a country wants to advocate more support from?
I think I would start off by saying I don't see my country just as a donor. I see us as a partner. I see us having agency in and of ourselves as well as in partnership with others. So what I've really tried to do here in Ethiopia, and it's been such an honor to be Ireland's ambassador here and to have the platform to do this, is to use my and my team's diplomatic engagement to advocate very strongly for women's involvement. And often as international partners, we possibly can say a little bit more than some of our partners on the ground, but we can be a voice for them. So I think that would be the first one, that we've really kind of articulated that priority through our diplomatic engagement. Of course, we are a development partner as well, and we do provide funding and we provide technical support. And I think that really should be, and the approach that we try and work on here is very much listening to the needs of the organizations that come to us for support or that we approach and identify that we could work with. And I think that's really important because, yes, we have our own priorities, but of course, they know the environment much better than I do or my team does. And I, recall one example where I was really keen to work with the women's rights organization here, and I was ready to provide funding, and we were talking about what that might look like. And they just said to me, this is not the time. We are not ready. We cannot engage in the environment right now. It's too challenging. And I was really taken aback, but really admired them in that they were able to say, press pause. We'll come to you when we're ready. And they have come to my embassy for support and they're ready to engage now. So I think that's really, really important. And again, it's great that we have the flexibility in the embassy to operate in that way. So I suppose that's kind of how we're doing it. That's part of it. And then, so I suppose the approach then, we focus very much on institutional and leadership capacity. So developing that for women's rights organizations so that when Ireland is no longer here or not necessarily a partner, they have that capacity and, that strength in their organization to move forward. We have supported and continue to support platforms for women's voice and agency. I talked about listening to the needs of the organizations. Two other things here I wanted to say. One is really responding to the trauma that women and girls have faced as a result of conflict is central to what we do. And I think that's just really, really important because how can we expect women in certain situations to take leadership roles where they've experienced huge trauma as a result of conflict? And we've initiated a number of, big programs in that regard. And again, this listening piece, I think, is so important because we were thinking, oh, yes, counselling, psychosocial support is what these people need. But they said to us, yes, we do need that. But we also need livelihood support because our livelihoods have been destroyed as a part of the conflict. So again, we listened and we tried to design the program to encapsulate that component as well for them. And then finally, we recognize, and this is a really good one, we also work to recognize the experiences of the women working in these complex situations. And a really lovely example of that is last February, we organized an event here at the embassy and we called it was on the theme of Women of Courage Across the Seasons, Inspiring Voices for Women's Rights. And we brought representatives from women's rights organizations in Ethiopia, across different parts of Ethiopia. We brought an Irish human rights commissioner over to share her experience. And we had a really fantastic event, really, really excellent. And I felt like although I was the host, I felt like I was a guest. And that to me was wonderful because people felt safe in the platform we provided to air their views and their concerns and their issues. So to me, that was really, really important. So yeah, I suppose that is our approach and what I've tried to instill with my team. I have a fantastic team working in this space, and they get it, and together. And it's not just Ireland. We bring in other international actors. We bring groups together. We try and forge connection, networking, understanding, partnership in the approach that we really adopt.
So, Ambassador Brennan, you've worked all over the world, from Ireland to all of those African countries you talked about to Indonesia. What are your reflections on how women have mobilized themselves to advance WPS? And what would you say is the lessons learned that might benefit WPS agenda in Africa? And maybe in this context, you want to just speak freely from your own kind of reflections.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think, first of all, I would go back to a point you made earlier about women's strength, resilience, and courage. And I think that, to me, drives women forward. And I think they've been absolutely fantastic in that regard. If I reflect on here in the country, I'm here right now in Ethiopia, and I see the challenges that women face in being included, but how they've gone to organize themselves, the lengths that they have gone to organize themselves. So, a number of years ago, I think it was my first year here again, we had a session on the Northern Ireland peace process, and I brought in a speaker from Northern Ireland, and then I brought in a number of grassroots organizations here and women's rights organizations. And we had this incredible discussion about the experience of the Women's Coalition in Northern Ireland. And it was all about strategy and positioning and opportunity and being ready. So, it wasn't necessarily what you can write down in a textbook, but the women in the room took this and they went out and they formed what they call themselves Timran here in Ethiopia. And it's a women's coalition, and it's bringing together women's rights organizations, and they're organizing themselves to be involved in this national dialogue process that's so central to Ethiopia's future and addressing what I talked about earlier, those underlying causes of conflict. So it's wonderful to see how that can happen. And it's not easy. We really have to get away from this, the women come together and things happen. Women have different views and different positions, etc. But we do have, I think, that common agenda for our voices to be heard. Women are incredible at mobilizing themselves. They may come from very diverse backgrounds, very diverse beliefs and political ideologies, but when they have a common agenda, and that is to advance women's rights, women's voice, women's participation, they can really demonstrate, and as I was saying earlier, in the Women's Coalition in Ireland, they came from all those diverse backgrounds, but they brought all of their skills together. So I suppose what would I say to the WPS agenda in Africa for that, and to women in Africa, is to really hold strong, hold courage. Transformative change is possible. It may not seem so, but often it's one step forward, 10 steps back. But then there is an opportunity where further progress can be made. And I do think building coalitions, networks, partnerships beyond your own country or your own environment is hugely important, because there's so much solidarity and so much support that can be garnered, and ideas. Somebody's tried something, it didn't work. Somebody else tried something else and it really did work. And I think there's, so much benefit in that for women, not only across Africa, but across the world. And I really, this, Yemisi, all the evidence shows that when women have been involved in peace process, they're much more sustainable, much more durable. So we have a lot as women on our shoulders. That's a huge responsibility to get in there and to really frame peace processes in a way that are sustainable for our kids, for our future generations.
And finally, when you reflect on all that we've discussed today, including your reflections on the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement from the perspective of women, what would be your recommendations on how to ensure women's meaningful participation in negotiations and implementation of peace agreements in Africa?
Again, a great final question. And I do think what we were talking about earlier about including women from the get-go is hugely important, not just at the end stages. So, including the initial and the high-level negotiations in the design of peace processes, that is really, really essential. We've talked a lot about what are the final recommendations throughout our discussion, but I really feel very strongly the need to continue to challenge gender stereotypes and gender social norms in ourselves. We need to challenge ourselves continuously, but in our communities and our institutions. And that's a huge issue globally, not just for Africa. We need to do it continuously. I think from the example of Northern Ireland, that thinking innovatively is really, really important, where women will come up with different ideas. It's just a different way of looking at things. And I think that's really fantastic. And we do also have to make it safe for women to participate, a point you highlighted earlier. And we need to put in place the frameworks and the support that women do feel safe and can participate. Somebody said recently they were in peace negotiations for 2 weeks. They never got out of the hotel room. So how can a mother who's breastfeeding her child be involved in a situation like that? It's not possible. We just have to create different ways of women to participate. I also feel very strongly about the need for ongoing capacity and support for women's visibility and voice. Like we talked about earlier, those platforms being flexible, being responsive, and then also these support for these initiatives for communities who've been deeply traumatized. And we've, too many examples of that across the world. And then I think the multilateral system has huge power in this area, but hasn't realized that potential. So we really need to continue to push that system to create the frameworks, the partnerships, the support for women's meaningful participation, agency, and voice in peace processes in Africa, but not only in Africa, in all parts of the world. As we see, we are experiencing huge challenges, not only on this continent, but in Europe, in the Middle East and elsewhere. And it's very, very challenging. This word polycrisis emerging is, new words emerging to describe the complexities of our global situation. And, for the good, as I said earlier, of our children coming forward, we really need women to be at the table in equal measure with their male counterparts in negotiating and implementing peace. And I know our women are so strong and resilient and passionate and can do it when given the space. And that's what we need to work on. So thanks a million, Yemisi.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Brennan. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today. That's it for this episode of She Stands for Peace. Until next time, stand for peace with Africa's Women, Peace and Security Agenda.